Parshas Parshas Vayera. What I'd like to do is go through the Talmudic text on the first Aliyah, just make everybody aware of them, and then after we go through the Gemaras, we'll do some Hasidic commentary. But first, I want to make sure everybody is familiar with. Everybody remind ourselves of the Talmudic text that deal with the first Aliyah, or the first passage, which is the passage of Abraham meeting these three men who came to greet him. So let us go through this discussion. The first 14 verses. So Vayera elav Hashem be'onei mamrei. So God appeared to Abraham in Elonei Mamre and the plains of Mamre. And he was sitting at the entrance to the tent in the heat of the day. The first thing that we learn from here, the Gemara in Sota 14a tells us, Mikan Shemimidas HaKadosh Baruch Hu Levaker Cholim. From here we learn that it is an attribute of God to visit the sick. And the Gemara elsewhere tells us, just like God visits the sick, we have to visit the sick. So this is teaching us that we have to copy the attributes of God. We are supposed to be godlike in our behavior. And so we see from here that we have to visit the sick. So this is very relevant for us. I feel bad because just a few minutes before I got on the phone with before we started this, I was on the phone with a very close friend, somebody who I love. But I got off the phone with him because somebody else who I was calling to visit the sick, to fulfill that mitzvah, was calling. And so while it's a mitzvah to talk to our friends, to just to be connected, it's a bigger mitzvah to visit the sick. And so therefore, this is how we are godlike in our actions, by copying the ways of Hashem. And one of the things that Hashem does is to visit the sick. We know that if you read this book by Telushkin about the Lubavitcher Rebbe, that the Lubavitcher Rebbe, after he reached a certain point in his life, he basically never, almost never left 770 or his house. But he did make a phone call when the Satmar Rebbe was sitting Shiva. It says the Lubavitcher Rebbe called the Satmar Rebbe. He fulfilled the mitzvah of visiting the sick. Fulfill the mitzvah of Nichum Avelim. There's a question where Moshe Feinstein was asked, can you fulfill the mitzvah of visiting the sick through a phone call? So do you think you can fulfill the mitzvah of visiting the sick through a phone call? And the answer is that you can, but not as well. Not as well. You don't fulfill the same mitzvah. And what's the reasoning? Because when you visit the sick, you're doing two things. First of all, you're talking to them, you're lifting them up, but also you're making sure physically if they need anything. Maybe they need some, like you notice that their pillow is not good enough, that the heat is not on properly. So there's two aspects to it. So through a phone call, it's a limited fulfillment of the mitzvah. But anyways, what's the next halacha? The next Talmudic text. So it says, Vayera elav Hashem. The Gemara in Bamitzia, we just did this like 100 days ago, tells us, also ayom shlishi l'milaso. That day was the third day of his circumcision. Uba Kadosh Baruch Hu l'shol shalom, and God came to ask about Abraham's welfare. So we know that the third day after his illness, why is the Gemara telling this? Because we know from the story of Shechem, and on the third day of their illness is the most pain. And so therefore Hashem came on the third day, because that was when Avram was in the most pain. And so therefore he came to visit him. It's also a custom that you're supposed to wait until the third day before visiting a person who is sick. That's what we learned halacha l'maaseh from this. This became like a practice. When you visit the mourner, you're supposed to wait also until the third day, unless you're exceptionally close. People don't go on the first 2 days of the mourning, the first 2 days of the illness. And what does the Gemara say about the heat of the day? So, what does it mean? It was the heat of the day. So the Gemara Bamitzia explains that day God made it especially hot. Why? Because it was the third day of the circumcision. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought out the sun from its sheath. Meaning to say, Hashem had intentionally made it exceptionally hot. Why did Hashem intentionally make it exceptionally hot? Because Hashem wanted to prevent the sick people from the wanderers, the travelers from coming, because then Avram would be in distress and he would go to take care of the sick people. So Hashem made it exceptionally hot to prevent the sick people to prevent the guests from coming to need Avram's home. But then Hashem saw that Avram was in more distress. But then he saw that Avram was in more distress that the guests weren't coming than if he had been taking care of the guests, and so therefore Hashem made the three men appear. This is like the story about the Rebbe who was sitting in the sukkah while it was raining on Sukkot, and so his student said to him, "Why are you sitting in the sukkah when it's raining? Don't you know that if you're in distress, you're exempt from sitting in the sukkah?" And the Rebbe answered, "It's more distressing for me to have to leave the sukkah than to sit in the sukkah when it's raining. So too, it's more distressing for Avram not to be able to fulfill the mitzvah of taking care of guests than to have to do some physical exertion of taking care of the guests." There are other midrashim that explain why it was so hot. Another explanation is that Hashem did it as a method of healing Avraham, because there are some Gemaras that talk about that the heat or the sun is good for a wound. The sun is like a disinfectant, and so therefore that makes sense. That after Abraham was healed, then the guest came because Abraham was healed at that point. So that's the idea. The next Gemara is based upon, we'll do the next pasuk. Vayisayina, the Avram lifted up his eyes. Vayar v'nei shlosha nashim. Abraham saw three men, Nitzavim alav, standing over him. Vayar, and he saw them. Vayoratz lekrosam, and he ran to greet them. Mipesach ha'oel, at the entrance to the tent. Vayishtachu arza, and he bowed down. So what's going on here? Let's look what the Midrash says about this. The Gemara tells us here in Bava Metzia, why are there three men? Who are these three men? That these were three angels. Who are these three angels who came to visit Abraham? They are Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael. Why is Michael there? Michael is coming to tell Sarah that indeed she's about to become pregnant. Raphael was coming to heal Abraham, and Gabriel was coming to destroy Sodom. So again, Michael to give Sarah the news, Raphael to heal Abraham, and Gabriel to destroy Sodom. But we have a problem. What's the problem? Because when it came to Sodom, how many angels were there at Sodom? There were two. It says that there were two men who went to visit Sodom. Now we have a problem. If all three were going to go together, then you need all three to be there. If you only need the one whose job was to destroy Sodom, you only needed Gabriel. So what are we going to do with this? So there we have to say that Michael went with Gabriel to save Lot. So Michael had two tasks. So his first task was to tell Sarah that she's going to have a child. And the second task was to save Lot. And the reason why we know only one angel was the one destroyed Lot, because it says in the verse by Lot, he destroyed the cities. Only one angel did it. So the Gemara tells us, the Bereshit Rabbah says, well, why didn't we have one angel do all three tasks? Why don't we have one angel do all three tasks? So that, the Midrash tells us a powerful idea about angels. The powerful idea about angels is Ein malach echad oseh shtei shlichut. One angel cannot do two missions. One angel cannot do two missions. So this is This is an important point for us to remember. We don't really know what angels are. Angel seems to be like a messenger from God, somebody who God sends to do his task. But the angel is limited. The angel doesn't have any creativity. The angel is on a mission. It's like a pilot. You send on a mission. The pilot doesn't know how to deviate. The pilot just goes straight to his destination. He puts in the GPS. His job is to pilot it. Now, he's not an explorer. So the angel can't do two tasks. And so therefore, it's to remind us that we are not angels, but in some ways we're much greater than them because we can grow, we can expand our tasks, we can develop new ideas, we can develop new missions, new mission statements for our lives. And so that's something fundamentally different than the angel. So there is a big question. There's a big question. Why do we see over here that they're called men? And so if that's the case, if the Torah specifically says that there are three men who are coming, why, if it says that they're human beings, Shoshan Hashem, why does he call them angels? Why does the Midrash and the Talmud call them angels when it says specifically that they're men? So the answer has to be that since Sodom, and this is what the Torah Tamima says, since by Sodom it calls them malachim, it calls them angels, that's clearly what the impression is over here. And we know that that angels often take the form of a human being. So too we find, for example, that when Joseph was wandering, he came across a man. And that it says Vayimtza'eu ish, and that man gave him directions to help him find his brothers. But the Zohar says that man was Gabriel. And there's a midrash here that says as follows: Amar Rebbe Levi. He says as following. He says, how did these three men appear? He says as follows in the Midrash Rabbah. Listen to this midrash if you ever heard this midrash before. Very powerful midrash. He says, Echad nidmelo b'dmut tzadaki. One of these angels appeared to him as like a person who sells bread. Tzadaki is somebody who's like a baker or a bread salesman. Echad b'dmus navati. One appeared to him like a sailor on a ship. Echad b'dmus aravi. And one appears like an Arab. And it doesn't explain, the Midrash doesn't explain why these three men are associated with a baker, a sailor, and an Arab. So what's the basis for this idea? So the Torah Tamima says the basis for this idea is from the verse. The verse says, I will take for you some bread. He says, he doesn't say I will give, it says I will take for you. And that hints to the fact that Abraham was saying to these angels, I'm going to buy some bread from you. Because he looked at him like he was a bread salesman. So the guests came, and Abraham's like, I want to buy some of your bread, and now I'll serve you. It makes it even greater. And then he said, Achar ta'avoro, and he says, then you will pass. He doesn't say, then you will go. So it looked to him like he was a sailor, because tavoro in the Bible is an expression of a sailor. It says Vayavru b'sochayam, Vayavera yardim, and so therefore he's saying to him, you're like a sailor, and so therefore you'll go on your ship. And then the third angel appeared to him like an Arab, because he says, wash your legs, and that was the practice of the Arabs in those days, that they used to wash their feet when they came to a place. Okay, everybody with me still? Let me just pause for a second, see if anybody's raising their hands. Okay, good. Now we go on. The next, we're still in the same pasuk bet. I want to say the next Gemara that says as follows: Vayar, and he saw them, Vayaratz l'kratam, and he ran to greet them. Why did he run to greet them? Mal Vayar Vayaratz. Why does it say he saw and he ran? So the same Gemara in Bava Metzia says as follows. So, hold on one second. Meaning to say, why was Abraham running after them? So the Talmud says as follows: Mikara asu kamu alei. At first, they were standing above him. Ki chazyuhu da'avilet Sarah. When they saw that he was in pain, Amr, they said, Lav orach ara lamekam hachi, va'azli lahu v'rai batzrayim. And the implication of this text means that at first they weren't going near him, and he saw them standing near him, and then he saw them that they were going away from him. So he ran out to greet them. And it states, Vayar, to hint about, it says in the verse, Vayar twice, because it says he saw them and he picked up his eyes and he saw the three men. And it says then he saw them and he ran to them. And so therefore, it's indicating he was looking for them. He was standing by the entrance to the tent and looking. But I always think about, when I read this Rashi, this pasuk, I always think about what the Lubavitcher Rebbe says. It says, why does it have, it says in general, not about this pasuk, why does it have to say he saw them and he ran? Why can't it just say he saw them and he went to them? And he said, come on in. Why does he have to run to them? The Lubavitcher Rebbe says, there's an expression which everybody can remember because it has big impact on me. Anything worth doing is worth doing right away. So that's what the Rebbe said. Anything worth doing is worth doing right away. So he says worth doing, it's worth inviting them in. I have to run to greet them. I have to run. Anything worth doing is worth doing right away. Okay, so now we're up to Pasuk Gimel, Vayomar, and he said, Adonai. Now, here's the whole debate amongst the commentaries if this word Adonai is an expression of God or it's an expression of like my master. It's not expression of God, it's expression of just regular verses. He says, if I find favor in your eyes, I'll not tavor me'alavdecha. Do not pass by your servant. The Gemara in Shabbos says, on Daf 127a, that we see from here that welcoming guests into your home is greater than receiving the divine presence. Because Abraham was in a conversation with God at that point. Remember, God had come to visit him. Abraham was in a direct conversation with God. And at that moment, he says, wait, God, hold on. So he asked God to wait. And so therefore, we see from here that accepting a guest is even greater than having a conversation with God. So what should you do if, let's say, you're davening the Amidah and all of a sudden a guest rings your doorbell? Should you stop the Amidah to go welcome the guest into your home? What do you think about that? I don't know. So that seems to be that the mitzvah of welcoming the guest is even greater than the mitzvah of talking to God. So the Gemara also in Shabbos tells us the following. Gemara in Shabbos tells us that, says Rebbe Elazar, come and see that the attributes of God are not like the attributes of flesh and blood. And attributes of flesh and blood, a minor is not able to say to somebody who's more senior than them, wait for me until I come to you. Whereas God says, Al na tavor. He says to God, just wait a minute. I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to come back to you. So the Gemara Megillah tells us that, and this is the Musar Haskell for us to remember from this idea, that in the place where you see God's greatness, you see God's humility. Here God is, we see God's greatness. He's telling Abraham, you're going to have a great nation. He's telling Abraham, we're going to destroy Sodom. He's going to bring his change to the world forever. But you see his tremendous humility, that God was willing to wait, be put on hold while Abraham went to take care of these total strangers, or the baker, the sailor, and the Arab. The Gemara in Bava Metzia tells us, what does it mean, al nata for? Says the Gemara in Bava Metzia. He says, he saw that God was standing by the entrance. And so since he saw that God was prohibiting and permitting, Amar Rav Orach Arla Mekamacha says it's not permitted. Hold on one second. Hold on one second. So he says it's not permitted. God was prohibiting and permitting. What was he prohibiting and permitting? He was prohibiting and permitting the guests to come. He was standing up and stopping it. Okay, let's do the next verse now. Yukach nama mayim. He says, take a little bit of water, and wash your feet, and you shall rest underneath the tree. What is going on here? Yukach na, take a little bit of water. Why does he only offer them a little bit of water? So let's see what Gemara in Bava Metzia said. Amar Yehuda Marav. Kol ma'asha asa Avram u'melachim ba'atzmo asa Kadosh Baruch Hu levana ba'atzmo. Now this is a very, very powerful. This is a very powerful Gemara. It's one of my favorite Gemaras. So it says, whatever God did for the angels himself, whatever Abraham did for these angels himself, God himself did for his children. The kol ma'asha asa yedei shliach asa Kadosh Baruch Hu levanav yedei shliach. Whatever Abraham did for the angels himself, God did for the Jewish people, Abraham's descendants himself. And whatever Abraham did through a messenger, God did to us through a messenger. And the Gemara is going to bring the examples. But the Gemara also goes on to say, if we only knew that everything we were doing was being written down for posterity, how much different would we act? Some people say, oh, we don't like the fact, everybody's videoing everything. It's so unnatural. And you're not really, once the video cameras come out, people are not as natural as they would be. But it's just the opposite. We should always live our life as though every single thing we're doing is being videoed, because everything is being videoed to be replayed back to us. When our time comes to meet our Creator, all of our actions are going to be saved for posterity. So all these things that Abraham did himself, he went the extra step and did it himself, then he merited that his children are going to receive it directly from Hashem Yisbarach. But all those things that Abraham did not do himself, he did it through an agent, okay, he still did a good thing. So God did for us, but only God did it through a messenger. As the Gemara tells us the example, it says, Al Bakar Rat Abraham. So Abraham ran to the cattle. So the wind came straight from God, and in Parashat Ba'alosla, Vayikach Chama v'chalav, Abraham went himself and took the milk and the butter. And it states, God says, I will give to you bread from the heaven. And he stood over them underneath the tree. And then God says to Moshe, I'll stand over you on the rock. Avram walked with the angels to send them off. He escorted them. So Hashem escorted Abraham's children. Hashem yomam. Yukach mayim, take a little bit of water. And it says that God says, V'ikita batzur, God told Moses, hit the rock, v'yatsa mimenu mayim, and the water will come out from it. Then Yukachna, Tana de Vayera Shmo, B'schar Shalosh Zachu Shalosh. It's the merit of these three things that Abraham offered at this time: the offering of a little bit of water, the washing your legs, and staying under the tree. we merited three powerful things in the wilderness. In the merit of the milk and the butter, Zachul Aman, we merited for the man to come down from the sky. B'scharhu made Olehem, for the fact that Abraham stood over them, we received the reward of the cloud following us in the wilderness. And B'schar Yukach Nama Mayim Zachul Be'er Shemariam. With the merit of the little bit of water, we merited to the well of Miriam. I actually love this midrash also, this Gemara, because this teaches us that even this conversation, which we think is an insignificant conversation, or not insignificant, but maybe a minor theme in the history of humanity. What, you have a guest comes over, you offer him a little bit of water, a little bit of bread, and you say, just rest for a minute here. This Gemara is telling us that transformed humanity, and the Jewish people were able to receive these miraculous gifts of the water, the man, and the cloud of protection in the wilderness. It all comes from this simple offer. How many times in life do you hear about like a simple encounter where somebody acts nicely to somebody, and then years later the favor is repaid? This is the message of not taking any single encounter, any single conversation lightly or for granted. It can have cosmic ramifications. We don't even know years later, 400 years later after this, the ramifications and the reward was finally being felt. So if that's the case, the Gemara has, there's a question. Didn't we say that the well came in the merit of Miriam, not in the merit of Abraham? But here we're saying it comes in the well in the merit of Abraham. So that's a little bit of a question which we would need to explain. But anyway, just putting it out there. Okay, wash your legs. What's the idea? So the Gemara asks, why was he washing their legs? Are you suspecting us of being Arabs who bow down to their dust? They're saying, why are you accusing us of being Arabs who are, in those days, they were idolaters, they bowed down to the dust. So the Gemara says, Kvar Yatza Mimenu Yishmael. Yishmael had already left him, meaning to say, or come forth from him, meaning to say, since he had already given sired Yishmael, he had noticed this type of behavior in the world, that there were people who were wandering in the wilderness, in the desert, who were bowing down to the dust. And it presumably, the Gemara is saying that he had seen this type of behavior even amongst Yishmael, his own son, at this point. Then he says, verse 5, Vecha paslachem, and I'll take a little bit of bread. V'sa'adu ibchem, and you shall satiate your hearts. Achar ta'avoru, and afterwards you shall pass. Ki al kein avartem el avdechem, because indeed, and then you can pass by your servant. Ki al kein, meaning to say, and only after that will you be able to pass on. And they said, yes, we will do just like you spoke. Kein taseh kasher dibarta. So this is also one of the most famous lines in the Gemara. It says, I'll take a little bit of bread, and let me offer you a little bit of bread. But then it says, what does Abraham offer them? It says, El Abakar Ratz Avram. Abraham runs to the cattle. Says Rabbi Lazar, Mikan L'Tzadikim She'omrim Ma'at V'Osim Harbei. The Gemara in Bava Metzia says, from here we learn that the righteous say a little and do a lot. Meaning to say, he says, I'm only going to give you bread. And in the end, he gives them meat. But by the wicked people, we see that it's just the opposite. Who is the paradigm of the person who does a lot, who says a lot but does a little? Who's the paradigm of that? Anybody remember the story of the man who said a lot but only did a little in the end? Oh yeah. Well, that's the story of every day. We encounter people who say a lot and do a little, especially in this town. Okay, fine. But who in the Bible is the one who says a lot and does a little? Anybody remember? You might not remember because it was a year ago. It's in Parashas. Who's the one who says, and more arbeva say ma'at? That is Ephron. That is Ephron. Ephron says, I'll give you the property. And then in the end, he takes 400 overos socher. So now we have to remember this to ourselves that we should be like Avram, understate, undersay what we're going to do, but in the end, do much more rather than being like Ephron, coming in, making all sorts of promises about how we're going to do, and in the end, doing very little. The Gemara also tells us in the Darim. Hold on 1 second. So the Gemara here tells us something very, very powerful also. Gemara says, Achar Tavaro, and then you can go. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Itor Sofrim, Halacha Moshe Misinayu. This is the Gemara Nedarim tells us that when the scribes crown something, that's a law from Moses at Sinai. And these words, Achar Toavoru, and after that you shall pass, that is what's called an Itor Sofrim. What does it mean it's an Itor Sofrim? Crown of the scribes. So here the Torah Tamima tells us that it means that these words are coming just to be a crown. And they're not needed. They're not needed, meaning to say, you could have just written Sadu Libchem Vitavoru. Why does it have to say the word Achar? The word Achar is irrelevant. It's only written with Tiferet Halashon, to be a literary flourishing or a literary embellishment. It's not a necessary word. It's just a literary embellishment. And so the idea is that the scribes embellished. This is a very, very provocative concept. Who are these scribes who are embellishing? I thought God gave exactly the Torah to Moshe, and Moshe wrote down word for word. But yet here we see that the Gemara is telling us that there's this concept that there are certain words that the scribes embellished and added in. How come by Abraham it says, thus you shall do just like you spoke? And by Lot it says, by Yiftzar Bam Ma'od, by Yasuru, and they beseech, by Yiftzar Bam, he beseeched them a lot, and they departed from him. Meaning to say, by Abraham, they did it, they immediately acquiesced. They said, do exactly like you told us, but by Lot, they didn't listen to him. So how come by Abraham they listened exactly to suggestion, but when Lot told them to come into his house, they didn't want to do. They did not want to go in there. So what's the difference between Abraham and Lot? So Amar Rabbi Elazar, Mekan Shemasarvon Lakatan Ve'im Masarvon Lagadol. We see from here an important point. That you can say no to a katan, to a minor person, but not to a great person. You're not supposed to say no when the great person asks you to do something. You're not supposed to say no. And so since Abraham was asking them, they couldn't say no to him. I told my son last night, when the rabbi of your shul, he's not in my shul, I said, whenever he asks you to do something, you're supposed to do it. You're supposed to do it. Except for one thing. I said, always listen to the rabbi. The rabbi asks you to give a shir, go to a minyan, to lead the davening, to read the Torah, to give tzedakah. You always have to listen. There's only one thing you're not supposed to listen. Anybody want to guess what I told him? What? I said, if he asks you to join the board of the synagogue, say, that's not for me. My talents will be used elsewhere. But everything else, whatever else he asks you to do, you do, except for joining the board of the synagogue. I said, that's That's somebody else's responsibility in life. That's not your tafkid. That's not your role. So anyway, I don't want to. Maybe Yavin, the Daiva Hakima or Miza, that's the one who understands. I'm not saying it's not important, but it's not for him anyway. And that's actually, I think, the first time in my life I ever told him not to do something. Was I said that's something that you shouldn't do if they ask him. Okay, so now we'll do one more pasuk here. It says, "Vayimaher Avraham, and Avram ran to the tent of Sarah. Vayomer Mahari Shalosh Siim Kemach Soas." It says, "Quickly prepare 3 seah of Kemach Soas. Kemach is flour and Soas is flour. Lushi Vasiugo, knead them and turn them into cakes." So it says Ksiv Kemach and it says Ksiv Soas. The Midrash says flour and Soas. Soas is fine flour, and Kemach is a little bit rougher flour. So why does it say these 2 terms? So the Gemara says, the woman was more stingy. She didn't want to spend the money, and she wanted to give them the lesser grade of the flour than the man. The man was ready to give everything. But if that's the case, so it should have said Soas Kemach. That's what Rashi says, that he said Soas first. But why is Soas written second? That's one of the questions. So that's a question. So Sefer Hasidim says at first Abraham just said just Kemach. And Kemach can include Kemach and Soas, the good and the bad. And then Abraham said, maybe I'll tell Sarah, maybe she's just going to give the worst if I say Kemach. So he added on Soas, give him the best. And then Sarah, and that proves that's why he was concerned, because he said, if I give her the choice, she'll give the worst one. So therefore, Avram wanted to make sure that he only gave the best one. So he said, give Soas. Anyway, these are some of the most beautiful Gemaras have to do with this week's parasha. And we're just touching the surface of it, just touching the surface. If anyone has any questions, I'll stop and